The Age of Heroes begins not with crowns or written laws, but with movement, vast human migrations pressing into an empty, frozen land. From the south came the first men, crossing land bridges and rivers, entering the north long before kingdoms had names. They did not arrive as conquerors in a single year, but as clans, warriors, and families pushing into forests of pine and valleys buried in snow. In this era, survival itself was rule. The north shaped its people through cold, distance, and constant threat. Stone circles rose in the wilderness, fortified camps appeared along rivers and hills. Power belonged to those who could hold land through winter and defend it with spear and shield. This moment marks the beginning of Northern Dominion, when human rule first took root in the lands that would one day belong to House Stark. In the deep time of the Age of Heroes, Northern rule solidified under a single name. Brandon the Builder emerged as a war leader and founder, uniting scattered First Men clans through strength, oaths, and survival against the cold. He did not inherit a crown, he forged authority by holding land when others failed. From his seat in the northern wilderness, he established a bloodline meant to endure winter after winter. This moment marks the true founding of House Stark, when rule in the north became dynastic rather than tribal. Brandon's authority rested on fortified ground, loyal warriors, and control of vital territory. His leadership brought permanence to northern power, transforming scattered settlements into a kingdom ruled from a single house. From this act, the Kings of Winter were born, and the Stark name became synonymous with rule, endurance, and the North itself. With House Stark established, northern rule required more than banners and oaths. It demanded stone. The construction of Winterfell marked the first true act of permanence in Stark history. Built upon open plains ringed by forests and snowbound hills, the fortress rose to anchor Stark authority in the heart of the North. Its walls were not raised for beauty, but for survival. Thick stone to endure cold, layered defenses to resist siege, and open ground to spot enemies long before they arrived. Northern laborers quarried rock, hauled timber, and shaped foundations through frozen seasons. Guards stood watch even as construction continued, because the North never allowed peace without vigilance. Winterfell was not simply a castle, it was a declaration. From this point forward, Stark rule was fixed to land, walls, and winter itself, ensuring that northern kings would rule from stone rather than memory. The long night did not arrive with warning or declaration. It began as a failure of seasons. Summers shortened, harvests failed, and the cold deepened beyond memory. In the north, darkness stretched longer each day until night itself seemed permanent. Snow buried roads, forests froze solid, and settlements vanished beneath ice. This was not a single battle, but a catastrophe that reshaped northern history. Communities abandoned open lands and fled behind walls. Watchfires burned without rest. Stark-held territory became a refuge as much as a battlefield against starvation and fear. The long night marks the first true existential crisis faced by northern rule, when survival overtook expansion and war. From this moment, the North ceased to grow and instead endured. Every decision that followed, fortification, consolidation, and defense, was shaped by the understanding that winter could become endless. As the long night deepened, survival turned into war. The North faced an enemy that did not seek land, tribute, or surrender. The others advanced out of the frozen wilderness, bringing death, silence, and cold that no season could break. Northern strongholds became front lines. Stark held lands organized for defense, not conquest, forming shield walls in blizzards and lighting signal fires across snowbound hills. Villages were abandoned to draw forces back behind walls. Warriors fought in darkness, guided by torchlight and horns rather than banners. This war reshaped northern rule forever, forcing the Kings of Winter to act as protectors of all the living in the region. Victory was not measured by territory gained, but by ground held through nightfall. The war against the others stands as the defining conflict of early Stark history, where the North fought not for dominance, but for continued existence. As the war against the others pushed the North toward collapse, one final decision was made when armies and walls proved insufficient. A lone figure, remembered as the last hero, set out from the north into the frozen wilderness. This was not a quest of exploration, but an act of necessity, approved by northern leadership facing extinction. With companions drawn from the first men, the last hero traveled beyond defended lands, moving through forests and mountains, already lost to endless winter. One by one, his companions fell to cold, hunger, and the enemy stalking the dark. The journey itself became the event, an organized departure beyond the last strongholds of the North, marking the first recorded northern expedition into total darkness. This decision reflects the moment when the North accepted that survival required action beyond fortifications, sending one of its own into the heart of the long night. When the long night finally began to recede, the North did not declare victory. Instead, it prepared for return. The decision to raise the wall was a political and military act rooted in survival, not triumph. Northern leaders committed to a permanent barrier at the very edge of the world, stretching from coast to coast across frozen land. Built of ice, stone, timber, and earth, the wall marked a new boundary of northern rule, one that no army would patrol lightly. Its purpose was singular: to separate the realms of men from the lands where the others had come from. Construction required vast labor, constant defense, and years of effort under brutal conditions. The wall transformed the North's strategy forever, shifting from open war to containment. From this moment onward, the North ruled not only land and castles, but a frontier meant to hold back extinction itself. With the wall standing, the North faced a new problem. Stone and ice could not defend themselves. The decision to found the Night's Watch was a deliberate act of governance by northern rulers, creating a permanent military order sworn to vigilance rather than conquest. Men were gathered to serve for life, drawn from across the North and bound by oath to abandon lands, titles, and bloodlines. Their duty was singular: to hold the wall, watch the darkness beyond it, and warn the realms of men if the threat ever returned. This was not a temporary garrison, but an institution designed to outlast kings. Fortified keeps rose along the wall, supply lines were established, and command structures formed. The founding of the Night's Watch marked the final transformation of northern defense, from reactive war to eternal readiness, ensuring the long night would never again catch the North unguarded. With the wall manned and the long night receding into memory, power in the North did not fracture, it hardened. The Starks emerged not merely as survivors, but as rulers whose authority now extended across generations. This period marks the rise of the Kings of Winter as a recognized and uncontested line, ruling from Winterfell with the memory of extinction still fresh. Northern houses bent the knee not out of ceremony, but necessity. Defense, justice, and survival flowed from a single seat. The Stark kings organized the North into a unified realm, enforcing loyalty through councils, marches, and decisive punishment of rebellion. Their rule was not expansive, but absolute within their borders. From this moment forward, the North ceased to be a loose collection of clans and became a kingdom bound by winter, law, and Stark blood. The Kings of Winter rose not through conquest alone, but through endurance proven over generations. With authority secured at Winterfell, the Kings of Winter moved beyond consolidation and began deliberate expansion. This phase of Stark history was defined by marches, sieges, and enforced submission across the vast northern lands. Independent clans,
hill kings, and rival strongholds were confronted one by one. Some bent the knee after Stark armies appeared beneath their walls. Others resisted and were broken. Campaigns were slow and punishing, fought through forests, frozen rivers, and mountain passes where supply lines failed as often as enemies did. Expansion was not driven by ambition alone, but by strategy. The North could not survive divided if winter returned. Each conquered territory extended Stark control over resources, manpower, and defensive depth. By the end of this period, the North existed as a single realm for the first time, its borders secured by force, its rule enforced from Winterfell.
As Stark authority expanded, resistance hardened in the eastern north. The Red Kings of Bolton, ruling from the Dreadfort, stood as the most dangerous rival to Winterfell. Unlike scattered clans, the Boltons commanded fortified lands, veteran warriors, and a long tradition of defiance. War between Stark and Bolton was not brief or ceremonial. It was brutal, deliberate, and fought across frozen forests and river valleys. Stark armies marched east under direwolf banners, meeting Bolton forces in shield walls and winter sieges. Villages changed hands, supply lines were cut, and prisoners were taken as warnings to those who would resist Stark rule. This conflict was fought not for expansion alone, but for survival of Stark kingship. Only one royal line could dominate the North. The war ended with Bolton defeat and submission, breaking the last great rival crown and securing Stark supremacy across the realm. As Stark expansion pressed deeper into the wild North, one enemy stood apart from ordinary kings. The Warg King ruled not through castles alone, but through fear, commanding warriors bound by ancient practices and mastery of beasts. His domain lay in the forests and frozen highlands where Stark authority had not yet reached. The Kings of Winter moved deliberately, knowing this war would not be decided by a single battle. Stark forces advanced through dense woodland and snow-choked valleys, drawing the Warg King into open conflict. When his armies were finally broken, his power collapsed completely. The Warg King was defeated, his strongholds destroyed, and his rule erased from the North. This victory was decisive, eliminating a form of rival kingship that could not be absorbed or tolerated. With his fall, Stark dominance extended into lands once ruled by fear rather than law. In the far north, beyond forests and open plains, the Umbers ruled harsh land from last hearth, answering to strength alone. Their warriors were numerous, their holds fortified, and their loyalty uncertain. As Stark expansion neared completion, the Kings of Winter moved northward to confront this final test of authority. The campaign against House Umber was not swift. Stark armies marched through deep snow and broken terrain, forcing engagement where the Umbers could not rely on distance or isolation. Skirmishes preceded open confrontation, and Stark forces pressed steadily until resistance collapsed. Faced with overwhelming force and the certainty of destruction, House Umber bent the knee. Their banners were lowered, their warriors disarmed, and their lands absorbed into the northern realm. This subjugation secured the northern frontier and ended the last major independent power within the North. With the far north secured, Stark authority turned southeast to the Barrowlands, where House Risewell and House Dustin held ancient lands, fortified hills, and hardened warriors. These houses did not rise in rebellion together by chance. Their territories controlled key roads, burial grounds, and river approaches, making them strategically vital and politically dangerous if left independent. The Kings of Winter launched coordinated campaigns to break both powers before alliance could turn into lasting resistance. Stark forces marched through frozen plains and low hills, fighting disciplined engagements rather than scattered skirmishes. Strongholds were surrounded, supply routes severed, and resistance worn down through winter pressure. One house fell before the other, but both were ultimately defeated and compelled to submit. Their banners were lowered, their armies disbanded, and their lands absorbed into the Stark realm. The Barrowlands were secured, closing the final gap in northern unity. With the last major rivals defeated or subdued, the rule of House Stark entered a new phase: consolidation.
This was not a time of expansion or war, but of enforcement. From Winterfell, the Kings of Winter moved to bind the North into a stable and obedient realm. Garrisons were placed in former rebel territories, hostages taken to ensure loyalty, and laws standardized across vast distances. Northern lords were summoned to Winterfell to swear renewed oaths, not as equals, but as subjects. Roads were secured, supply routes protected, and borders reinforced. The purpose was clear. Rebellion would no longer be met with negotiation, but prevention. This consolidation transformed Stark power from a conquering force into a governing one. From this point onward, Stark rule was no longer contested in arms. The North stood unified under one house, one law, and one seat of power. With the North unified under Stark rule, stability required more than conquest. The mountain clans, hardened by isolation and constant survival in the high ranges of the North, had never been fully subdued by force. Instead of war, the Kings of Winter chose alliance. Stark envoys traveled into the mountains under guard, meeting clan leaders in harsh terrain where castles held little meaning. Agreements were forged through mutual defense, shared enemies, and recognition of clan autonomy in exchange for loyalty. The mountain clans pledged warriors when called and agreed to protect key passes and high roads vital to northern security. This alliance strengthened Stark control without bloodshed, extending influence into regions no army could easily occupy. By binding the mountain clans through oath rather than conquest, the Kings of Winter secured the North's most dangerous borders and ensured unity through cooperation, not endless war.
Long after the wall was raised and the Night's Watch established, a crisis emerged not from beyond the wall, but from within it. A Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, remembered only as the Night's King, abandoned his vows and seized control of the wall itself. From the Night Fort, he ruled as a tyrant, declaring himself king and binding the Watch to his will. For 13 years, the wall was held not as a shield for the realms of men, but as a seat of forbidden rule. The North could not tolerate this betrayal. The Kings of Winter joined forces with the rulers beyond the wall to overthrow him. The Night's King was defeated, his name erased from record, and his actions forbidden to be spoken of openly. This event reshaped Northern law, reinforcing that no power, no matter how distant, could stand above Stark authority and the purpose of the wall. The reign of the Night's King did not end quietly. After years of unlawful rule from the Night Fort, the North moved with decisive force. The Kings of Winter could not allow the wall, built to protect the realms of men, to remain in the hands of a self-crowned tyrant. Stark armies marched north through deep snow, while forces from beyond the wall advanced from the opposite side, sealing the Night's King between them. The campaign was swift and deliberate. The Night Fort was surrounded, its defenders cut off from supply and support. Faced with overwhelming pressure, the Night's King was captured and destroyed, his followers disarmed and broken. His name was struck from records, his deeds forbidden to be remembered as honor. The fall of the Night's King reaffirmed a central northern law. The wall existed only to serve the living, and no crown could ever rise upon it again. With the North unified and its borders secured, the Kings of Winter turned to order that could not be enforced by sword alone. The worship of the old gods, practiced since the Age of Heroes, was formally sacrosanct as the spiritual foundation of northern rule. This was not the creation of a new faith, but the recognition and enforcement of an ancient one. Sacred heart trees were protected, groves maintained, and oaths sworn before the carved faces of the weirwoods were declared binding across the realm. Northern law and belief became intertwined, strengthening loyalty through tradition rather than decree. Lords were required to uphold these customs, and justice was often rendered beneath the branches of the heart trees. By establishing old gods' worship as central to governance, the Kings of Winter reinforced a shared northern identity, one rooted in land, memory, and continuity, binding the people of the North together beyond blood and banners. With conquest complete and unity secured, the Kings of Winter turned authority into order through law. Stark law was not written to impress courts or merchants, but to endure winter and distance.
Justice became direct, personal, and unmistakable. The ruler who passed sentence was expected to enforce it, binding judgment to responsibility. Laws were standardized across the North, ending the chaos of local customs and clan justice. Crimes of treason, desertion, and oath-breaking were punished without delay, while land rights and obligations to Winterfell were clearly defined. These laws were carried by riders, enforced by garrisons, and upheld by fear of consequence rather than ceremony. Stark law transformed the North from a conquered realm into a governed one. From this point onward, loyalty was measured not only in words, but in obedience to a single system of rule, law that spoke with one voice, from the Wall to the Barrowlands. While the North stood unified under Stark law and ancient custom, a new force appeared far to the south. The Andals crossed the narrow sea in longships and war fleets, landing first along the southern coasts of Westeros. They did not come as traders or settlers seeking permission. They arrived as warriors, bearing steel weapons, new tactics, and an aggressive will to conquer. Coastal villages were attacked, strongholds burned, and local rulers slain or driven off. Andal warbands pushed inland from their beachheads, defeating first-man kingdoms that were unprepared for the speed and brutality of the invasion. This moment marked a turning point for the South, as old realms began to fall one by one. Though the North was not yet invaded, the arrival of the Andals reshaped the balance of power across the continent and introduced a threat that would eventually test even the kings of winter.
As the Andals carved their way through the southern kingdoms, their advance eventually turned northward. Warbands tested the neck and probed the edges of northern lands, expecting the same fractured resistance they had crushed elsewhere. Instead, they met a realm hardened by winter, law, and unity. The kings of winter did not wait behind walls. Stark forces mobilized quickly, blocking mountain passes, fortifying river crossings, and striking invading Andal columns before they could establish supply lines. Battles were fought in snow and forest, where southern tactics failed and heavy armor slowed movement. Andal raids were repelled, their prisoners taken, their leaders executed as warning. Unlike the South, the North did not fall piece by piece. Stark resistance halted the invasion entirely, preserving first-man rule and old gods tradition. This defense ensured that while the South was transformed by Andal conquest, the North remained unconquered and unchanged. Long before written law or crowned kings, the North was shaped by an agreement born of exhaustion and survival. After generations of brutal conflict between the first men and the children of the forest, neither side could achieve total victory. The wars had scarred the land and threatened extinction for both peoples. The pact ended this destruction. Under its terms, the first men were granted dominion over the open lands, fields, and hills, while the forests were left to the children. Sacred sites were protected, and the worship of the old gods was preserved as a shared spiritual bond. In the North, this agreement endured longer and more faithfully than anywhere else in Westeros. Stark rule later inherited this legacy, enforcing the pact's boundaries and customs as law. The pact laid the foundation for Northern identity, one built on restraint, memory, and coexistence rather than endless conquest. With the North secured by law and border, the kings of winter turned to a quieter but vital task: trade. Survival alone was no longer enough. Stability required movement of goods, food, weapons, and people across vast distances. Stark authority organized and protected trade routes linking Winterfell to the Barrowlands, the White Knife, the Western Hills, and the Neck. Roads were cleared, river crossings guarded, and way stations established to support caravans through snow and forest. These routes allowed grain from fertile pockets to reach harsher regions and ensured iron, timber, and furs flowed towards central stores. For the first time, the North functioned as an integrated economy rather than isolated regions. Trade strengthened Stark rule without bloodshed, binding distant lands through dependence and reliability. By establishing protected trade routes, the kings of winter transformed unity into permanence, ensuring the North could endure not just war, but peace and winter alike.
With borders secured, laws enforced, and trade routes protected, the Kings of Winter formalized what had long been reality. Winterfell was declared the permanent capital of the North. This decision transformed the ancient stronghold from a royal seat into the center of governance for the entire realm. From Winterfell, laws were issued, justice rendered, taxes collected, and military commands dispatched. Lords were required to attend councils within its walls, binding their authority directly to Stark oversight. Roads, supply networks, and communication lines were all oriented toward the castle, making it the heart through which northern power flowed. Winterfell's location, central, defensible, and surrounded by loyal lands, made it ideal for this role. By establishing Winterfell as capital, the Kings of Winter ensured that rule of the North would remain unified, organized, and anchored to a single seat capable of enduring both war and winter for generations.
As fire and conquest swept across the south, the north could not remain untouched. Torrhen Stark, king in the north, marched south with a host hardened by winter, crossing the neck to face a threat unlike any the north had ever known. At the Trident, Stark banners stood opposite the forces of Aegon the Conqueror. Reports of Harrenhal's destruction and the power of dragons weighed heavily on every decision. Torrhen inspected his lines and considered the cost of resistance, not just defeat, but annihilation of his people and the end of northern rule. The North had survived the long night, Andal invasion, and centuries of war through restraint as much as strength. On that field, Torrhen chose survival. He lowered his crown and bent the knee, ending the line of Kings of Winter. The North was not conquered by fire. It was preserved by a single, irreversible decision.
The decision made at the Trident was given final form in ceremony and law. Torrhen Stark's choice to bend the knee was no longer only a battlefield judgment. It became a binding act that reshaped the North's future. Before Aegon I Targaryen, Torrhen surrendered his crown, his sword, and the ancient title of king in the North. In return, the North was spared fire, destruction, and the loss of its people. Stark rule did not vanish, it was transformed. Torrhen rose not as a defeated enemy, but as warden of the North, charged with ruling in the king's name. The North entered the Seven Kingdoms not through conquest, but through submission born of calculation. This moment ended thousands of years of independent northern kingship. From that day forward, Winterfell ruled the North under dragon authority, its power preserved by surrender rather than annihilated by war. With the crown surrendered and the old kingship ended, Stark rule did not disappear, it was redefined. After submission to Aegon I, Torrhen Stark was formally confirmed as Warden of the North, entrusted with governing the largest and harshest region of the realm in the king's name. This was not an empty title. The wardenship preserved Stark authority over northern law, justice, defense, and tradition. Winterfell remained the seat of power, and the ancient bonds between Stark and Bannerman were left intact. The change was political, not cultural. The North would answer to the Iron Throne in name, but it would still be ruled by those who understood winter. By accepting the wardenship, Torrhen Stark ensured continuity instead of ruin. Stark power survived conquest by adapting, allowing the North to remain unified, governed, and protected under familiar rule, without dragonfire or devastation. After submission and the confirmation of Stark wardenship, relations between the North and the Iron Throne required more than oaths and titles. Marriage alliances became a measured instrument of stability. While the North guarded its customs fiercely, the Starks understood the value of binding blood to power. Negotiations were conducted through envoys and councils, focusing on fostering trust rather than surrendering autonomy. These unions were arranged carefully, respecting northern law while acknowledging royal authority. The intent was not to merge cultures, but to prevent future conflict by tying the ruling houses together through family obligation. Such alliances ensured that the North remained a loyal pillar of the realm without losing its identity. Through marriage, Stark loyalty was reinforced without dragonfire, and Targaryen rule was strengthened without force. These bonds marked a new era, one where peace was maintained not only by armies, but by lineage and mutual interest.
After submission and the confirmation of Stark wardenship, relations between the North and the Iron Throne required more than oaths and titles. Marriage alliances became a measured instrument of stability. While the North guarded its customs fiercely, the Starks understood the value of binding blood to power. Negotiations were conducted through envoys and councils, focusing on fostering trust rather than surrendering autonomy. These unions were arranged carefully, respecting Northern law while acknowledging royal authority. The intent was not to merge cultures, but to prevent future conflict by tying the ruling houses together through family obligation. Such alliances ensured that the North remained a loyal pillar of the realm without losing its identity. Through marriage, Stark loyalty was reinforced without dragonfire, and Targaryen rule was strengthened without force. These bonds marked a new era, one where peace was maintained not only by armies, but by lineage and mutual interest.
With the age of Northern kingship ended, House Stark entered a new political reality that demanded consistency as much as restraint. Loyalty to the Iron Throne was not assumed, it was demonstrated. The Starks upheld royal decrees in the North, enforced the king's peace, and answered summons when called. Northern levies were raised in the crown's name, taxes collected according to royal law, and justice delivered without contradiction to the realm's authority. This loyalty was not rooted in affection, but in honor and obligation. The North did not forget its independence, yet it did not challenge the new order. By governing faithfully as wardens, the Starks ensured the Iron Throne had no cause to intervene directly in Northern affairs. This balance preserved autonomy through obedience. Stark loyalty became a stabilizing force in the Seven Kingdoms, quiet, firm, and unbroken, binding the cold North to the realm through duty rather than fear. When the Faith militant rose in rebellion against the Iron Throne, the conflict shook the Southern Kingdoms with religious violence and civil war. In the North, the response was measured and restrained. House Stark did not march south to fight in battles driven by faith foreign to Northern custom. Instead, the wardens of the North focused on preserving order within their own lands. The old gods were not challenged by the faith, and no uprising took hold beyond the neck. Stark forces secured roads, fortified crossings, and ensured that no faith militant armies entered Northern territory. While the Iron Throne struggled to suppress rebellion in the south, the North remained stable, governed by law rather than doctrine. This role, defined by absence rather than presence, proved critical. By refusing entanglement in southern religious wars, the Starks protected the North from devastation and reinforced the principle that Northern loyalty to the crown did not require submission to foreign faith or fanaticism. When the Blackfire rebellions erupted, the conflict was not a distant southern quarrel, it was a direct challenge to royal legitimacy. House Stark answered as it had since the conquest, with loyalty to the lawful king. Though the heart of the fighting lay far from the North, Stark banners were called, and Northern levies marched south in support of the Iron Throne. Their role was not to seek glory, but to reinforce stability. Northern forces guarded supply lines, secured key roads, and joined royal hosts where needed. Stark commanders avoided reckless assaults, instead providing disciplined strength to campaigns strained by betrayal and divided loyalties. The rebellions were ultimately crushed, and the Blackfire claim broken. Through measured participation, the Starks proved once more that their loyalty was not ceremonial. In times of dynastic crisis, the North stood firm, supporting the crown, suppressing rebellion, and preserving order without ambition or excess.
When the Iron Throne called, the North answered with movement, not speeches. Orders issued from Winterfell set the realm in motion. Banners were raised, levies assembled, and supply trains prepared for a long march beyond familiar snowfields. Northern armies did not rush. They advanced with discipline shaped by winter logistics and distance. Columns formed along established roads, crossing rivers, passing through the neck, and moving steadily into southern lands. This march was not conquest, it was obligation. Stark commanders coordinated with royal envoys, ensuring routes were secured and provisions guarded. The sight of northern hosts moving south carried weight, proof that loyalty was backed by force. Though far from home, the armies maintained order, avoided excess, and marched as a unified body under direwolf standards.
Each step south reaffirmed the North's role as a pillar of the realm, reliable in war, restrained in conduct, and bound by duty to the crown. With their duty fulfilled and the southern campaigns concluded, the northern armies turned homeward. The march north was quieter than the departure, marked not by urgency but by endurance. Columns retraced familiar roads, crossing rivers, forests, and the neck as colder air returned and snow thickened beneath their boots. Discipline remained firm. The North did not dissolve into celebration before reaching its own land. Losses were counted, banners inspected, and units reorganized as they moved closer to Winterfell. For many soldiers, the sight of northern forests and frozen plains signaled survival rather than victory. When the host finally reached Winterfell, there was no triumphal display, only order restored. Garrisons were reassigned, levies dismissed, and command returned fully to northern governance. The return marked closure. The North had answered the realm's call and now resumed its watchful stance, anchored once more at Winterfell, ready to endure whatever winter or war might come next.
As the North settled into its role within the Seven Kingdoms, attention returned to the Wall. The Night's Watch, long diminished by time and neglect, entered a period of renewed strength. Kings and wardens recognized that peace in the North depended on vigilance beyond it. Recruits were sent north from across the realm, criminals offered a choice, volunteers seeking purpose, and second sons without inheritance. Castles along the Wall were repaired and reoccupied, supply lines reinforced, and patrols increased. Stark oversight ensured discipline and coordination, binding the Watch's mission to northern security rather than southern politics. This growth was not marked by glory, but by endurance. The Watch did not expand to conquer, it expanded to hold. Through renewed numbers and organization, the Night's Watch reclaimed its role as the silent shield of the realm, standing watch so that the North and the kingdoms beyond could endure in safety. Beyond the Wall, pressure never ceased. Wildling bands tested the frozen frontier year after year, seeking passage south through force, stealth, or sheer desperation. The response was constant vigilance. The Night's Watch increased patrols, reinforced gates, and coordinated closely with Winterfell to ensure rapid response to large gatherings beyond the Wall. When wildling attacks came, they were met with discipline rather than panic. Archers held the heights, shield walls secured the gates, and ranging parties intercepted raiders before they could scatter south. Captured attackers were restrained, questioned, and held under guard according to Watch custom. Fires were extinguished quickly, breaches sealed, and supply lines maintained through brutal weather. This defense was not a single battle, but an enduring campaign. By holding the Wall against repeated incursions, the Watch, backed by Stark authority, preserved the realm's northern boundary and prevented chaos from spilling into the north. After decades of war, marches, and obligation to the realm, Winterfell required renewal. The castle had endured generations of strain, hosting armies, councils, and returning hosts, yet it remained the backbone of northern rule. Under Stark direction, Winterfell was rebuilt and strengthened with clear purpose. Walls were repaired and thickened, towers reinforced, and gates redesigned to withstand prolonged siege. Storehouses were expanded to hold grain and supplies sufficient for long winters, while barracks were improved to support larger garrisons. Roads and inner yards were reorganized to allow faster movement of troops and messengers. This effort was not cosmetic, it was strategic. Winterfell was shaped to function as both fortress and capital, capable of resisting attack while governing the vast north. Through rebuilding, Stark rule invested in permanence, ensuring that their seat of power would endure long after wars faded and winters returned. With wars ended and borders secure, the North entered a rare period of sustained peace under Stark rule. This calm did not weaken authority, it tested it. Governance replaced warfare as the primary duty of Winterfell. Stark rulers focused on maintaining order across vast distances, ensuring that law was applied evenly from the Wall to the Barrowlands. Garrisons remained alert, roads were kept open, and trade continued under protection, but armies stayed largely at home. Justice was administered steadily, disputes between houses settled through councils rather than force. Lords were expected to rule their lands responsibly, while Winterfell monitored loyalty through oaths, hostages, and regular summons. Peace in the North was not idle, it was disciplined. By ruling firmly without constant war, the Starks demonstrated that their power did not depend on conquest alone. Stability itself became proof of authority, showing that the North could endure not only hardship, but calm. Peace did not soften the heirs of House Stark. From childhood, those born to rule the North were raised with the expectation of war, hardship, and command. Education at Winterfell balanced governance with discipline, but martial training was never optional. Stark heirs learned to ride in snow, to fight in heavy armor, and to endure cold without complaint. Swordplay, archery, and command drills were overseen by veteran warriors who had marched south and returned. Lessons were practical, not ceremonial. Heirs trained alongside guards and bannermen, learning respect for those they would one day lead. This tradition ensured that no Stark ruler would face war unprepared or misunderstand the cost of command. By raising their heirs as warriors first and lords second, the Starks preserved a leadership style rooted in action rather than privilege. The North remained secure because its future rulers were forged long before they ever wore authority. With the passing of the previous lord, authority in the North transferred to Rickard Stark, marking a generational shift in Winterfell's rule. His succession followed ancient northern custom, oaths renewed, banners affirmed, and command formally assumed within the castle walls. Rickard inherited a realm at peace but bound by obligation to the Iron Throne, requiring careful balance between tradition and royal duty. As Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, he took responsibility for law, defense, and the loyalty of bannermen spread across vast distances. Councils were convened to confirm continuity, garrisons reviewed, and patrols maintained. Rickard's rule emphasized order and preparedness, reinforcing the Stark expectation that peace must never dull readiness. His ascension did not alter the North's character, it reaffirmed it. Winterfell remained steady, governed by a lord shaped by northern discipline and the weight of inherited duty. With Rickard Stark firmly established as Lord of Winterfell, the line of succession was made clear to the North. Brandon Stark was formally acknowledged as heir, a declaration that carried both expectation and warning. In the North, an heir was not merely a future lord, but a leader in preparation. Brandon's position placed him under constant observation, from bannermen gauging his temperament to household guards measuring his discipline. He was expected to attend councils, observe justice, and train relentlessly in arms. This recognition was not ceremonial alone. It signaled continuity and stability at a time when dynastic certainty mattered. By naming Brandon openly, Rickard ensured there would be no dispute when authority passed. The North understood succession as survival. An heir had to be visible, tested, and accepted long before rule began. Brandon Stark's elevation marked the next generation stepping into the long shadow of Winterfell's responsibility. As the political landscape of the realm shifted, Rickard Stark pursued alliances beyond the North to secure his house's future. One of the most significant was forged with House Baratheon of Storm's End. This alliance was not born of war, but of careful planning. Through betrothal, the Starks bound themselves to a powerful southern house known for martial strength and loyalty to the crown. The agreement created mutual obligation. The North gained a reliable ally beyond the neck, while the Baratheons gained northern support in times of conflict. Councils and envoys formalized the bond, ensuring it was recognized by both houses and the Iron Throne. This alliance marked a turning point. For the first time in generations, the Starks tied their fate closely to southern politics, not through submission, but through shared interest. The bond with House Baratheon strengthened Stark's position on the eve of coming turmoil. For a Lord of the North, the journey south was never routine. When Rickard Stark departed Winterfell for King's Landing, it marked a deliberate step into the heart of southern power. The road was long, crossing the Neck, the Riverlands, and regions far removed from northern custom. This journey was undertaken not for war, but for diplomacy, councils, alliances, and the maintenance of Stark's standing at court. Escorts were chosen carefully, supplies prepared for changing climates, and routes secured in advance. Rickard traveled as a warden, not a king, representing the North within the structure of the realm. Each stage of the journey reinforced distance, cultural as much as geographic, between Winterfell and the Iron Throne. Yet presence mattered. By appearing in King's Landing, Rickard ensured the North was not governed by rumor or assumption, but by direct voice and visible authority within the realm's center. Brandon Stark's journey south ended not in council or diplomacy, but in chains. Arriving in King's Landing after learning of his sister's disappearance, the Stark heir acted with the directness expected of the North. He publicly demanded justice and accused the Crown Prince of grave wrongdoing. In the capital, such words were not answered with debate. Brandon was seized by royal guards, disarmed, and taken into custody before the court. His arrest was swift and absolute, carried out under the authority of the Iron Throne. No northern law shielded him here. The act sent shockwaves northward, turning alliance into crisis and diplomacy into peril. Brandon's detention marked the first irreversible step toward catastrophe. What began as a demand for honor became a political crime, and with the heir of Winterfell imprisoned in the south, the fragile balance between North and Crown fractured beyond repair. Rickard Stark's arrival in King's Landing was meant to secure justice for his son. Instead, it delivered him into the heart of royal tyranny. Summoned before the Iron Throne, the Lord of Winterfell was not granted a lawful hearing by northern or even common Westerosi standards. Charges were proclaimed without evidence, witnesses denied, and judgment predetermined. Rickard demanded a trial by combat, invoking an ancient right recognized across the realm. The demand was accepted in form, but twisted in practice. The Crown's justice became spectacle rather than law, stripping the process of honor or fairness. Northern custom, restraint, and legality found no place in the Red Keep. The trial was less about guilt than submission. By placing Rickard Stark in chains before the court, the Crown sent a message. Ancient oaths and lawful rights would not restrain royal will. This trial shattered trust between North and Throne, transforming political crisis into open rupture. The crisis reached its point of no return within the Red Keep. Rickard Stark's demand for lawful justice was answered not with honor, but with cruelty. Before the court, the Lord of Winterfell was condemned under the guise of a trial by combat that offered no champion and no chance. His son Brandon was forced to watch, restrained and powerless, as the Crown delivered its judgment. The executions were carried out publicly, intended as a warning to all who might challenge royal will. No northern law, no ancient right, and no alliance was permitted to intervene. In a single act, both the present and future of House Stark were struck down. News of their deaths traveled north with devastating speed, turning loyalty into fury and restraint into resolve. These executions shattered the final bond between the North and the Iron Throne, making war not a choice, but an inevitability. The executions of Rickard and Brandon Stark left no safety for their remaining kin in the capital. Eddard Stark understood this with brutal clarity. With the court hostile and the crown openly violent, remaining in King's Landing meant death or captivity. Ned did not flee in secrecy for cowardice, but for survival. Trusted allies moved quickly, arranging horses, routes, and escorts beyond the city's watchful eyes. The escape was urgent and restrained. No banners, no announcements, no challenge. Guards were avoided, gates passed under false purpose, and the city left behind before royal suspicion could close in. Ned carried more than grief northward. He carried truth, rage, and obligation. His flight marked the final severing of Stark loyalty to the Iron Throne. From that moment, the North's remaining heir was no longer a subject seeking justice, but a man racing home to raise the realm against a king who had broken all law. The news reached Winterfell with winter speed and northern weight. Rickard Stark was dead. Brandon Stark was dead. With those words, restraint ended. Authority in the north passed to Eddard Stark not by ceremony, but by necessity. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Ravens were sent to every holdfast, carrying a single command. Banners were to be raised, and men assembled. Lords of the North answered without delay, knowing this was not a border skirmish or royal summons, but a reckoning. Garrisons expanded, stores were opened, and war gear issued. Winterfell became a center of mobilization as riders arrived daily, pledging swords and lives. This call to arms was not rebellion born of ambition, it was justice demanded by blood. For the first time in generations, the North prepared for war against the crown itself. What began as grief hardened into resolve. The North would not kneel again. With banners raised and armies assembled, the North made its choice. The executions of Rickard and Brandon Stark transformed grievance into open war, and Eddard Stark led the North into rebellion alongside Robert Baratheon. This was not a reckless uprising, but a calculated commitment rooted in broken law and blood debt. Stark hosts marched south from Winterfell, disciplined and unified, joining allied forces to challenge royal authority that had abandoned justice. The decision bound the North's fate to a wider conflict, extending war beyond vengeance into a struggle for legitimacy. Northern commanders coordinated routes, secured supply lines, and maintained order as the host moved beyond familiar snows. By entering Robert's rebellion, House Stark crossed the final threshold from protest to war. The realm would no longer be mended by words. Steel, loyalty, and endurance would decide the future, and the North would not stand aside. Once the North committed to rebellion, war ceased to be preparation and became movement. Stark forces entered the southern kingdoms as part of a wider campaign aimed at breaking royal control region by region. The northern host did not charge blindly into battle. Marches were planned, supply lines secured, and alliances coordinated with rebel commanders already in the field. Engagements were fought where advantage could be taken, river crossings held, roads contested, and loyalist forces forced to respond rather than advance. Battles unfolded across fields and fortified positions, often in unfamiliar terrain far from snow and forest. Northern discipline proved decisive. Shield walls held, archers advanced methodically, and cavalry struck only when ordered. Prisoners were taken, camps overrun, and royal momentum slowed. These campaigns were not defined by a single clash, but by sustained pressure. Through coordinated southern warfare, House Stark turned rebellion into a credible, advancing threat to the Iron Throne. The war ended not with negotiation, but with collapse. After months of coordinated rebellion, the Targaryen grip on the realm finally broke. Loyalist armies were shattered in the field, their commanders defeated, and the capital fell to rebel forces. With the death of the last defending king and the flight of surviving royal heirs, 3 centuries of Targaryen rule came to an abrupt end. For House Stark, victory was neither triumphant nor celebratory. It was final. The rebellion had begun with injustice and blood, and it concluded with a kingdom changed forever. Northern forces secured positions, accepted surrenders, and restored order where resistance remained. The Iron Throne no longer answered to dragon blood. The outcome vindicated the North's decision to rise, proving that restraint had ended for a reason. Victory over the Targaryens reshaped Westeros, closing one dynasty and clearing the path for a new rule forged by rebellion and resolve. With the war concluded and the Targaryen dynasty overthrown, Eddard Stark turned north at last. His return to Winterfell marked the end of years spent in conflict, loss, and responsibility far from home. The journey was quieter than his departure for war, yet heavier in consequence. Ned returned not as a son or brother, but as Lord of Winterfell, bearing the weight of a broken generation. The gates opened to receive him as banners were lowered in respect, not celebration. Garrisons stood ready, bannermen gathered, and the North recognized its new lord without dispute. Ned's return restored stability to a land that had waded through blood and winter. From Winterfell, he resumed Stark rule, grounded in duty rather than ambition. The rebellion had changed the realm, but the North endured. With Ned Stark home, northern governance was restored, anchored once more in the cold stone heart of Winterfell. With war concluded and the realm reshaped, the North turned inward to restore order under Stark rule. Eddard Stark assumed full authority at Winterfell, not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. Garrisons were restructured, bannermen reaffirmed their oaths, and governance resumed according to northern law. Lands disrupted by war were secured, roads reopened, and justice reestablished without vengeance or excess. The North did not celebrate victory with spectacle. It stabilized through discipline. Ned's rule emphasized continuity with the past, honor, restraint, and preparedness, ensuring that rebellion did not fracture internal unity. By restoring Stark governance swiftly and decisively, Winterfell reasserted itself as the uncontested center of northern power. The wounds of war remained, but authority was clear once more. The North stood whole, ruled again by those it trusted, under a lord shaped by loss and duty rather than ambition. With war ended and authority restored, the North entered a period of hard-earned peace. Under Eddard Stark, governance focused on healing rather than expansion. Garrisons remained vigilant, but armies stood down. Roads were secured, trade resumed, and bannermen returned to their lands under renewed oaths. Justice was administered steadily, without spectacle or cruelty, reinforcing trust in Winterfell's rule. The Night's Watch continued its duty, the Wall held firm, and borders remained quiet. Peace in the North was not complacent, it was disciplined. Winter stores were rebuilt, patrols maintained, and councils convened regularly to prevent disorder before it took root. This calm proved the strength of Stark leadership, the ability to rule without war. After years of bloodshed, the North endured not through conquest, but through order, stable, watchful, and prepared for whatever winter might come. With the Iron Throne claimed by House Baratheon, the North entered a new political era defined by distance rather than interference. Under King Robert's rule, the North was left largely to govern itself, a recognition of both geography and Stark reliability. Eddard Stark ruled as Warden of the North with broad autonomy, enforcing royal law through northern custom rather than southern decree. Taxes were collected, justice administered, and defenses maintained without constant summons from the capital. The Iron Throne demanded loyalty, not presence. This arrangement preserved stability. While the South adjusted to a new dynasty, the North remained unchanged in practice, cold, disciplined, and orderly. Stark banners flew without challenge, and Winterfell continued as the unquestioned center of authority. Under Baratheon rule, the North did not thrive through favor or courtly politics, but through trust earned by restraint. The realm was united, yet the North remained itself, watchful, distant, and prepared. With peace secured and authority unquestioned, House Stark emerged from rebellion restored in strength rather than diminished by loss. The North stood unified behind Winterfell, its bannermen loyal, its borders secure, and its governance stable. Years of war had tested Stark leadership, but the outcome reaffirmed its legitimacy. Garrisons were maintained at full readiness, the Night's Watch continued to receive support, and internal order was preserved without coercion. Stark justice regained trust, applied firmly yet without cruelty. Winterfell once again functioned as the unquestioned center of northern life, military, legal, and cultural. The strength of House Stark was not measured in conquest or royal favor, but in endurance. The North obeyed because it trusted. By surviving the fall of kings, rebellion, and regime change, House Stark proved its resilience. Its power was restored not by decree from the South, but by the unwavering loyalty of the North itself. Long before crowns were bent to the Iron Throne, the North was ruled by the Kings of Winter. Their reign ended in title, but not in influence. Even centuries later, their legacy shaped every aspect of Stark governance. The Kings of Winter forged a tradition built on endurance rather than conquest, rule earned through protection, justice, and survival in a hostile land. Their laws favored responsibility over luxury, duty over display. Winterfell itself stood as their greatest monument, a fortress designed not for glory but for permanence. Even after bending the knee to southern kings, House Stark continued to rule as the Kings of Winter once had, independently in spirit, disciplined in law, and unwavering in defense of the North. This legacy outlived rebellion, dynasty, and peace alike. The North remembered its kings not for crowns worn, but for winters survived, and that memory continued to define Stark rule long after the last king was gone. In the years before the Great War engulfed the Seven Kingdoms, House Stark stood stable, respected, and largely removed from southern turmoil. Under the rule of Eddard Stark, the North was governed with consistency rather than ambition. Winterfell functioned smoothly as both fortress and seat of law, its bannermen loyal and its borders secure. The Night's Watch remained supplied, northern roads were protected, and justice was applied without excess. Relations with the Iron Throne were formal but distant, marked by obligation rather than intimacy. The North had little interest in court intrigue, focusing instead on internal order and defense. This period represented the last moment of uninterrupted Stark stability. The house was strong, united, and prepared, but unaware that events beyond the neck were already moving toward conflict. Before the Great War began, House Stark stood whole, anchored in duty, and unbroken by division. At the end of war, rebellion, and dynastic change, House Stark remained what it had always been, the guardians of the North. Titles had shifted across centuries: kings of winter, wardens of the north, lords under distant crowns, but the role itself never changed. From Winterfell, the Starks continued to defend the realm's harshest frontier, uphold law across vast and unforgiving lands, and maintain the wall through constant support of the Night's Watch. Their authority rested not on fear or wealth, but on trust earned over generations. When southern kingdoms fractured, the north endured. When kings rose and fell, Stark rule remained stable. By the close of this chapter, House Stark stood unified, respected, and prepared, watchful against threats from beyond the wall and wary of dangers from the south. As guardians rather than conquerors, the Starks concluded this era not in triumph, but in duty fulfilled. The North was held. Winter was awaited. The story does not end here. The history of Westeros continues in the chapters yet to be uncovered.